specific focus of the impact of looking at the impacts of flooding on housing sold price, the number of days on market, that when you're trying to sell a house, how long does it stay on the market, and the number of listings placed on the market in flood impacted communities. And also, do we see an impact on mortgage arrears? That's all kind of puts you in a bad mood, because I can tell you right now, the numbers are going to go in a negative direction. But we've also, in Canada, done an awful lot of work to develop guidelines and standards focused on mitigating flood risk. So that's the good news. And I'll profile what some of that work looks like, and emphasize the fact that now what we need to focus on is distributing this information, operationalizing it, mobilizing it to prepare communities and homes for flood risks that, if otherwise left unattended, will be rather costly. So that's more or less where we're going to head. And let's start with the first point first, that climate change is real and irreversible. And if I could have the next slide, please. So the position that climate change is irreversible, and that attendant to that the severity of weather will increase, associated with weather will increase. This is not just my cavalier opinion. This is an opinion expressed by several authoritative bodies, most notably just probably 2 months ago or something like that. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released this report, Climate Change 2021, the Physical Science Basis. And in that report, and this is authored by several hundred climate scientists from around the world, in that report, they state that, and I'll read the material on the screen, and it's in italics because I'm quoting directly from the report. They said, it is indisputable that human activities, which refers to the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, are causing climate change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe. And the notable part on this quote is the term indisputable. There is no question about it that it is the burning of fossil fuels that is driving the climate change that we're observing. The average temperature on the planet over the course of the last 100 years is up about 1.1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial times. At first, that might not sound like much, but when you consider the fact that the difference in temperature on the planet today versus an ice age is 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, being up 1.2 degrees Celsius over effectively the infinitesimally small period of time of 100 years, driven through the burning of fossil fuels, is a pretty big deal when you consider the difference in temperature on the planet today versus an ice age is 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. As a result of this elevated temperature, we're going to see more severe storms. There's more energy in the system with more heat, and amongst other things, warmer air carries more moisture, and when that moisture comes down in the form of precipitation, we have bigger rainfall events with more veracity attached to them. The upper report complements well a report released in 2019 called Canada's Changing Climate Report 2019, which was authored by about 8 or 10 climate scientists from Environment and Climate Change Canada, where in that report, they document that Canada's climate has warmed and will warm further in the future, driven by human influence, i.e. the burning of fossil fuels. This warming is effectively irreversible. And I think this is the first time that at least I can recall, or that I saw, where the federal government acknowledged the fact that climate change is irreversible. It's here to stay. This isn't suggesting that we don't work aggressively to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, but it also gave a very clear signal that we need to learn to adapt to extreme weather risk, and we need to do so rapidly. Over the last 10 or 12 years in Canada, the probably maybe up to 18 months ago, 90% of discussion on the topic of climate change focused on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, and only about 5 or 10% focused on adaptation to climate change. But now, particularly over the last 18 months, where we've seen extreme weather events in the forms of floods in the south, fires in the west, extreme heat events, increasingly so, people are getting religion on the fact that climate change is here to stay, and we're starting to see the manifestation of extreme events more notably. Core to the mechanism that's driving climate change, and I mentioned the burning of coal, oil, natural gas, but even more fundamental than that, one of the primary drivers is the fact that the net population on the planet right now changes by about 9,000 people per hour. In other words, every single hour, if you subtract deaths from births, there are 9,000 more people on the planet right now. And that translates through to, if you do the math, about another 80 to 82 million people on the planet per year, new people, on top of the 7.9 billion people that we currently have, which means that by 2030-35, we'll have another 1.2 billion people on the planet on top of the 7.9 billion people we currently have. And just in case you're not depressed enough now, just to put those numbers in perspective, if you go back to the time of Christ, so 0, there were about 250 million people on the planet. Basically, it was empty. And it took from the time of Christ to 1930 to get to 2 billion people on the planet. So in 1930, there were 2 billion people on the planet. From 1930 till now, so more or less 90 years, we've added another 5.9 billion people to the planet. So in 90 years, we've added 2.5 times as many people to the planet as what previously took 2,000 years. And we're going to add another 1.2 billion people by 2030-35. And these are all people who have to be housed, clothed, educated, and demand energy. So therein lies one of the fundamental drivers of climate change. And also, and we don't have time to go into it, but now climate change is actually driving climate change through positive feedback loops, driven by the about a 40 to 45% loss of ice in the Arctic region over the last 40-45 years, due to the melting of permafrost, which release methane into the atmosphere, which is a potent greenhouse gas that causes warming. The more warming you get, the more permafrost that melts. And we've lost about 16 to 18% of algae in the surface layer of the ocean, which through a slightly longer explanation also affects climate change, driving climate change. So all of this is to point out and paint the picture of the formidability of the challenge that as much as we focus on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, we really have to prepare for the extreme weather that is not just here now, but the more extreme weather that's coming for sure. Next slide, please. So what do the costs associated with climate change look like at the level of Canada? And probably the best way to document those costs numerically is through the data that you see on the screen. And what you're looking at here along the x-axis is time. So in 1983 in the lower left-hand corner up to and including 2020. And the gray bars reflect the total amount of money paid out on an annual basis by the insurance industry for catastrophic loss insurable claims. And in insurance language, a catastrophic event is any event like a flood, fire, hailstorm, windstorm, whatever it might be. If it triggers more than $25 million in claims, that's called a catastrophic event. And then there are groups in Canada, like the Insurance Bureau of Canada and others, that tally up or add up these numbers on an annual basis and present them as you see on the chart. And by the way, all of this data has been corrected for inflation to $2020 and for per capita wealth accumulation. In other words, if you were insuring twice as many homes today as you were 10 years ago, you would assume that if nothing was going on, your insurance claims would be twice as high. So that impact has been factored out of this data so that horizontally, we're looking at a comparison of apples to apples. And what's notable here is that from 1983 up to 2008, the insurance industry could count on paying out between about $250 to $450 million per year in insurance claims. But everything started to change from 2009 onwards, whereby for 11 out of the last 12 years, and shortly it's going to be 12 out of the last 13 years, the catastrophic loss claims have gone over $1 billion per year, every year for 11 out of the last 12 years, for an average cost of about $1.8 billion. And I just saw some preliminary data the other day, the 2021 data, even if nothing happened between now and the end of the year, it's going to be a great big healthy gray bar on the right-hand side of this chart of stuff still going in the wrong direction. The factor that's driving most of the upward bend in this curve is too much water in the wrong place, flooding. Flooding is the #1 cost of climate change in Canada, of an extreme weather event. and in particular, residential basement flooding. Residential basement flooding is the #1 cost of climate change in Canada today. And just on the upper left-hand corner of the slide, a few more statistics. As a result of the phenomena shown on the graph, annual home insurance premiums over the last 5 to 6 years have increased by about 20 to 25%. Over 50 to 60% of that increase is due to water in basements. There's an increase in the percentage of homes across the country that are now proving to be uninsurable. Literally Halifax to Victoria, increasingly so. We have people when their insurance comes up for renewal on their house, if they've made water claims and or if they happen to be in an area that's deemed at high risk, very often they're finding themselves uninsurable, their home. It's still insurable for theft and fire, but not for water in basements. And or the cap limits, the amount the insurers are willing to cover basement flooding to go up to, that is coming down, much more so commonly in the zone of $10,000 to $20,000. Right now, the average cost of a weather-induced flooded basement, not if your dishwasher overflowed or the pipe on your washing machine went, but for weather-induced basement flooding, the average cost of a flooded basement in Canada is $43,000. So if you had the average flooded basement due to weather, $43,000 damage, and let's say you had $10,000 or $20,000 coverage, in the blink of an eye, you could be on the hook for $20,000, $30,000 minimally out of pocket that you would have to spend to bring your basement back into working order, which, by the way, you would have no choice but to do, because very often, unless you're on a septic system, we're talking about sewer water in a basement. If you're on a combined storm sanitary sewer system, we're talking about sewer water in your basement, which if it floods on a Monday, you have to solve the problem by Wednesday of that week, or the house is uninsurable. So it's based on, and by the way, the bottom point there, just make sure I don't forget that these are the insurable losses. For every dollar in insurable loss, there's about $3 to $4 in uninsurable damage done in the country. And by the way, the upward bend in the curve is not driven only by a changing climate and more severe precipitation events, more water coming down over shorter periods of time. That is for certain a contributor. But it's also driven by the fact that, for example, here in Southern Ontario, over the period of the last 100 years, we've lost about 72 to 73% of the natural infrastructure that was originally here, the forests, the fields, the wetlands, that gave water a place to go and sit on the landscape and discharge slowly downstream or into the groundwater system. We've lost about 72, 73% of that natural infrastructure has now been either paved over or turned into some form of agricultural development. And by and large, when water hits pavement, it runs off very quickly to the lowest point around, which might be someone's basement. So loss of natural infrastructure contributes to flood risk, and then aging municipal infrastructure and aging housing infrastructure. So it's a confluence of factors that create the situation we're in, climate change being one of them. Based on this type of information, we asked a fundamental question, and that was when catastrophic flooding, big storms, hit communities, what impact does that have on the residential housing market? What impact does it have on housing sold price, if anything? What is the impact on the number of homes positioned in a community for sale in the aftermath of flooding? Do they go up or down? Is there a difference? The length of time that a house sits on the market in the aftermath of flooding in a flood impacted community, is there a difference there? And do we see, because we know there's costs associated with basement flooding, when people are hit in a community by flooding, in the aftermath of flooding, do we see an impact on mortgage arrears or defaults, or deferrals, people not being able to pay their mortgage or asking for deferral payments on their mortgage? So we considered this question, and by the way, what we did is, without going into all the details, we identified a number of cities across Canada from west to east that had been hit hard by flooding. And we looked at the changes in those parameters that I just mentioned, the real estate parameters, for how they changed for a period of 6 months before a flood versus 6 months after a flood. What was the average cost of housing in a community for 6 months before a flood versus the average cost of housing in a community 6 months after a flood. And we compared that to a nearby community, that change we saw in the flood impacted community. We compared the change to a community that was similar in all regards, in close proximity to the flood impacted community, but that community had not been impacted by flooding. So that could work as that worked as our control group to say that if flooding had no impact, we would expect the same change in housing price over time in the flood impacted versus non-flood impacted community. If we did see a difference, we could attribute that difference to the flooding itself. We isolate it for that effect. So that was the process we engaged. And next slide, please. So what did we find? And this will all be in the report that we release in about 5 or 6 weeks. So the bottom line is this: for multiple cities across the country, and in a minute I'll show you what those cities were and the communities within those cities. But what we found for multiple cities or locations within cities that were impacted by flooding, in the aftermath of flooding, for a period of up to 6 months following a flood, the change in the average sold price in a community due to flooding was a reduction of 8.2% on the sold price of homes. There was a hit of 8.2% on housing price. The average number of days on market when you go to sell a house in a flood impacted community, houses set on the market for 19.8%, rounded off to 20% longer. And in flood impacted communities, the average number of listings, the homes listed for sale, was reduced by 44%. 44% fewer homes listed for sale in the aftermath of flooding, presumably due to perhaps people either fixing their homes up in the aftermath of flooding, or they're waiting for the stigma of their community, their house being a flood impacted community to pass, perhaps before they put their house on the market. Now that last point is just speculation on our part, but this is the data that we found. We found effectively no material impact on mortgage arrears or deferrals. And I think this is testimony to the fact that to get a mortgage in this country, you have to jump through a lot of hoops to qualify. And you can see that the impact of flooding was such that it did not exacerbate or have a material influence on mortgage arrears. And let me just show you a little bit more detail of what we did, what it looked like. Next slide, please. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the cities that we considered in the study. We had 5 cities and 6 events. So Grand Forks, British Columbia, Burlington, Ontario, Toronto, Ontario, 2 floods in Ottawa, and Gatineau in Quebec. And the dates of the flood were as per the months down to a specific date. So what we did for, so the collective data for all these cities combined, and in the report, we break them all out on a city by city basis. But if we look at, for example, the average sold price of homes in a community, pre-flood versus post-flood, in the flood impacted community for a period of 6 months after a flood occurred, and that's looking at the left-hand side of the chart in blue for water. So we thought that was rather clever to depict water. We saw a decrease in housing price 6 months after a flood occurred of minus 3.1%. When we compare that to the community very close by, the same in all regards except not hit by flooding, over exactly the same period of time, houses in that community increased in sold price by 5.1%. The delta, the difference between the two, is the combined number of 8.2%. There's overall an 8.2% loss in housing price could be attributed to flooding that otherwise you would have realized the upside for. So and then we did exactly the same kind of analysis for the number of days on market and the number of houses listed on the market and mortgage arrears on a city by city basis. But I highlight this point because this is the one that Canadians are going to zero in on. This will be the front page of the report on business section of the Globe and Mail when we release this report. By the way, I'm not exaggerating that. We've already set that up with them. Anyhow, those are the financial costs. But again, it's not just financial costs associated with flooding of residential housing. There's also psychosocial or mental health costs. And one of the things we did, and if you've ever talked to anybody who experienced a flooded basement, they by and large, they're pretty animated and disturbed by having gone through the event of realizing a basement full of water. But what we wanted to know was there really mental health stress associated with this long term? So we went to a community, Burlington, Ontario, just a little bit west of Toronto, that in August of 2014, they experienced a major flood. 3,300 homes were flooded out in Burlington, which relative to the population of Burlington, that's a lot of homes. And due to a flood event catalyzed by about 190 millimeters of rain coming down over a 6 to 8 hour period. So it affected 3,300 homes being flooded, including the mayor's home, Rick Goldring, who had lived there for 30 years, never seen a drop of water in his basement. Now he had 5 feet of water in his basement. We went back to Burlington 3 years after that event occurred, not 3 weeks, not 3 months, but 3 years later. And we polled people at the door, asking them a series of questions that effectively amounted to, how much stress do you feel each time a major precipitation event occurs? And we asked this question of people who were on streets that were flooded versus a street nearby that wasn't flooded, or homes on the same street, some were flooded, some were not flooded. If I could have the next slide, please. And what we found, what you're looking at here, we asked people to rank their stress on a scale of 0 to 5, 5 being the worst for the mental stress you feel. And we found that for flood impacted homes, 48% of people polled ranked themselves as a 4.5 to 5 out of 5 in terms of the stress they felt every single time a precipitation event occurs, as compared to effectively no stress for those who lived in homes that had not been flooded. And what was notable here was the fact that this wasn't 3 weeks later or 3 months later. This is the stress people live with, period, long term. This was 3 years later. And it was to the point that, you know, even 3 years later, they would report things like, every time there's a major rain event at night, my husband and I are up 3 times during the night to check the basement to see if there's any water in the basement. The kids come home from school, and the first thing to do if it's rained all day is they go down to the basement to see if there's any flooding. So the financial costs and the psychosocial or mental health costs associated with flooding are both material. So this is all the bad news. Now, what's the good news look like? And next slide, please. I would say it's good news in the sense that there is good news in the sense that in Canada, we have not just been sitting on our hands on the flood file. And by the way, we work on a lot of other events that I'm not mentioning, fire, extreme heat, and other perils. But tonight we're just focusing on flooding. In Canada, we've done a lot of work to figure out ways we've done a lot of work to develop guidelines and standards that, when applied, can mitigate flood risk at a variety of levels. In the upper left-hand corner, we have a standard and a guideline to mitigate risk at the level of the home. What can you do around the outside of the property and in the basement itself to lower the probability that you end up with a flooded basement, which I'll describe in a minute. But, and by the way, every report you see here benefited from the contributions of about probably 60 to 80 people who were experts in some area of flood. Builders, developers, insurance people, legal people, conservation authorities, various NGOs of multitudes of types. A lot of people contributed to this stuff, led by the way, the Standards Council of Canada, the National Research Council, Canadian Standards Association, and quite frankly, the Intact Center right in the middle of it. So, so when you see these reports, each one of which is maybe 60 to 80 pages in length, but has an upfront 3-page executive summary that tells you 90% of what you need to know. They were well informed by a lot of people who understand these topics. The lower left-hand corner, we have good guidance on how to build new residential communities going forward, such that when the big storms hit, they don't all flood out. For existing communities, we have good guidance on how to mitigate flood risk for existing communities. For commercial real estate, office towers, condo towers, and so forth, we have good guidance on how to lower the probability that underground parking lots will flood, or if they do, how do you minimize damage to the telecommunications, electrical systems in the facility? What can we do to retain and restore natural infrastructure in the country to mitigate flood risk. And by the way, sequester carbon, support biodiversity, minimize the discharge of pollutants in throughout ecosystems, and support aesthetics. And in about 3 weeks from now, we're launching a new coastline resiliency standard for Canada's east and west coast that address means to how we're going to address going forward as a country, sea level rise, storm surge, and king tides hitting simultaneously on the Atlantic and the Pacific coast. That only leaves, by the way, one area that we haven't considered, and that'll be done, I think, within 2 years, and that is a shoreline resiliency standard for the Great Lakes. That's another kettle of fish. And by the way, all these reports are available if you go to the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, and you'll see a button that says, I think it's resources and reports. All of these are listed there, and they're all free, and you can download anything you want. And by the way, we took the key findings from these reports and put them all into one central report under one umbrella that's sort of one-stop shopping on best practices to mitigate flood risk. I spent a lot of time with ministers, deputy ministers, mayors, councillors, you name it, across the country. And you can't walk in and give them 12 reports or 10 reports, whatever. So what we produced one report that gives the core message on how to mitigate flood risk all in one place. Now, when we were writing the housing report, one of the things we did, the one in the upper left-hand corner, we went into about 700 homes across Canada in New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. And we looked around the outside of properties and into the basement itself. We spent about an hour to 3 hours per home documenting anything at all that might contribute in terms of the characteristics around the outside of the property and the basement itself to exacerbate flood risk. And if I could have the next slide, please. And I won't dwell on every bar you see here, but what you're looking at is effectively a summation of our results. The green bars document things around the outside of the property of the house, aspects around the outside of the property of the house that could contribute to flooding. The blue bars are factors within the house itself that can contribute to flooding. And at the bottom of the screen are in yellow, those are maintenance issues. So let me just describe one or 2 points here. And it's actually, quite frankly, I was flabbergasted when we got these results to find out how often there were very simple things wrong with homes en masse that could be easily corrected that would limit the probability that someone's basement floods. For example, on the top green bar, the downspouts that come down the side of your house from the east trough system and to discharge water, 78% of the time, they dump the water within 2 meters of the foundation of the house, and generally speaking, a lot closer. That water builds up along the wall of the house, percolates down the wall into the weeping tile system and effectively back into the basement. We found that sump pump we found that around 69% of homes in the second green bar down, 69% of homes we examined, say 70%, have somewhere around the house that the grading directs water towards the house versus away from the house. 70% of homes have somewhere around the house where the water is directed towards the house versus away. Sump pump discharges. Many people have a sump pump in their basement to pump water out of a well in the basement outside in the event that water might enter into the basement. 68% of the time, sump pumps discharge water right at the wall of the house, at the foundation of the house. The water, again, percolates down the wall, through the weeping tile system, into the basement, keeps the sump pump running all the time until it burns out. In blue, the top blue bar, no sump pump backup power. For homes that have sump pumps to pump water out during big storms, the time you need the sump pump to work is during the big storms. Very often when these storms occur, that's when the electricity goes out. So if you don't have backup battery supply or some other form of independent generation to run the pump during the big storms, it is of no value to you at the time you need it most. And let me just jump down to 1 or 2 here. On the bottom blue bar, this has nothing to do with climate, well, it does have something to do with climate change, but it's even independent of that. Believe it or not, we found that 35% of the homes we went into, for the little drain that's in the basement, that if your dishwasher overflowed or pipe broke in the house, water would drain out of the house. 35% of homes had that drain in the basement covered up, either tiled over or some other way occluded, such that if water built up in the basement, it had nowhere to go. That's not a climate change issue. That's just poor household management. And then some of you I'll just go to the top yellow bar. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that if you have where you have your drain in the basement and water goes out through a pipe into, if they're older homes, generally speaking, a combined storm and sanitary sewer system. This is if you're not if you're in a urban suburban community. Very often when big storms hit, water can surge up through that system and into your basement. So you put a little valve on that drain line in the basement that makes it such that water can flow out, but it can't flow back in. It can't flow up into the basement. But if you don't maintain what's called that device called the backwater valve, if you don't clean it twice a year in the spring and the fall, 85% of the time it will not seal properly and water will float up into your basement. So 53% of people reported that they never maintained the sub pump from one year to the next, which the backwater valve, which effectively means it's just a decoration in the basement. So next slide, please. As was already mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and in your community, you've distributed this material, but just for a few of you who have not seen it, we developed just a simple infographic to give people guidance on things they can do around their house along the top row for nothing, for free, that require very little expertise, that can lower the probability of having a flooded basement. The items in the second row, for those of you, again, who have never seen it, identify actions you can take around a house for less than $250 generally that will lower the probability of realizing flooding. And the bottom row are actions that you can take that are a little bit more than $250, but generally not very much, that people can put in place, again, to address flood risk. And they're as simple as, I won't go through them all, but on the top, and this is all on our website as well, under reports and resources. On the top, we show a picture of a sub pump. One of the things you want to do if you have a sub pump in your basement is every month or 2 months, test it to make sure it works. Dump a bucket of water in the sump well, see if it turns on and pumps water outside. If it does, you're in good shape. If not, if it doesn't turn on, if it ceased, you want to replace it. Most people find out that their sub pump doesn't work for the first time when they have 3 feet of sewer water in the basement. In the middle row, you can engage actions as simple as putting plastic covers over window wells for windows at grade level to make it such that when the big storms hit, the water doesn't fill the window well and subsequently flow into the basement. Or if you, the lower right-hand corner, if you do have a sub pump, put a battery backup supply system on the sub pump so that for sure it will run when the big storms hit. If the electricity goes out at the time you need it, it will be there. And it is almost all the actions outlined on this infographic can be operationalized by the average homeowner over a long weekend with no special expertise, and for generally speaking fewer than a couple of $100, which is a pretty good deal when you consider the fact that the average cost of a flooded basement is $43,000. This is the best investment in equity you can make, period. Warren Buffett would love this. Next slide, please. Then we're almost done. I'll just mention a few points that right now, along the lines of what you've just seen, we've developed training courses that are free, about an hour and a half in length, that focus on climate change, flood risk, and home flood protection, that are now up and running and taken for professional credit by the bodies you see on the screen here, the professional organizations and the number of people associated with those organizations. We're now putting them through the system. For example, with the Insurance Brokers Association of Canada, insurance brokers, we have about 3,000 to 5,000 have gone through so far, and the course has just been up and running for about a year. We're educating 38,000 insurance brokers on climate change, home flood risk, and home flood protection, so that when you meet with your insurance broker and they've taken this course, for which they receive professional credit, they can give you good guidance on actions to take around your house to lower the probability of basement flooding. We're doing exactly the same thing now with the Canadian Association of Home and Property Inspectors. Mortgage Professionals Canada, when you get a mortgage, you'll receive guidance on home flood protection. With banks and credit unions that hold mortgages, and with real estate agents now taking the course. That's 130,000 in the lower left-hand corner. So effectively in Canada, we haven't gone to government, we've gone to creating armies of individuals in the country that can bring the messaging of home flood protection directly to homeowners. Next slide, please. And we were quite pleased, maybe about a month ago or 6 weeks ago or so, I'm not quite sure. But when the Prime Minister and John Wilkinson, and we worked with them for months and months and months, really years, but adamantly in the last few months, when they announced the Climate Adaptation Home Rating Program. And effectively what it amounts to is that many of you would be familiar with Canada's EnerGuide program, whereby you can have an evaluation made of your house, supported through the National Research Council, on the energy efficiency of your home, an assessment of the energy efficiency of your home, and with recommendations, do you need more insulation in the attic or better windows or a more efficient furnace, etc. Combined with that, going forward, we now have the green light that individual that comes to do home energy efficiency will also be trained to do an evaluation of your property for flood risk, for an examination around the outside of the property and the basement itself pertaining to flood risk, and give you a report that not only focuses on energy efficiency, but flood risk protection, all in one-stop shopping. And just to finish off, and I won't go into details here, but this is for anybody to review, and again, these reports are all on our website. We're also now working very aggressively in reference to new community design and with existing communities to deploy guidance on actions that can be taken within existing communities, for example, to first identify where are the areas at high risk within communities of flooding to occur, and then what actions can be deployed within the communities relative to those locations that are at high risk of flooding to send water to safe locations to keep people and property out of harm's way. And that's working to, starting, and then we have the same guidance for how to build new residential communities going forward, such that when the big storms hit, they don't all flood out. And that starts with, by the way, don't build on a floodplain. We're working aggressively on programs now to retain and restore natural infrastructure and to mitigate flood risk. And that works in combination with built infrastructure that can also be put in place to mitigate flood risk. And here I just sort of re-emphasize from the previous slide that we've done quite a bit of work to identify if you have natural infrastructure upstream of either in urban or suburban communities and big storms hit, through modeling that we've done with the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and the Prairie Climate Center, we have found that when the big storms hit, if you have natural infrastructure upstream versus completely built infrastructure, you can reduce the damage realized due to the floods by 29 to 38%, the financial costs associated with major flooding. In other words, retaining natural infrastructure or restoring it has a material impact on lessening the costs associated with flooding. And this is a study we did to actually get a handle on what do those numbers look like. And it was in the zone of 30 to 40% savings if you have natural infrastructure upstream. It's a good thing to hold on to natural infrastructure. So what we're doing, particularly as you'll see when the report comes out on home flood costs, we're working aggressively across the country to distribute the 3 steps to home flood protection guideline that was mentioned in the introduction to myself. That's been distributed in your community. That's now being distributed, generally speaking, with property tax notices, amongst other places across the country that in their property tax envelope, people have to open that. They can't dismiss it as junk mail. And in it, they receive guidance on the infographic on home flood protection. We have MPs, MPPs, councillors, et cetera, across the country, putting this guidance on home flood protection into the communiques and with their constituents. We have insurers, real estate agents under point 3, mortgage brokers, home inspectors, distributing information on home flood protection through to their clients or customers. We're working aggressively right now to bring the flood risk maps up to date in the country. And what under point 5, what now exists in the US is you can, for any address in the United States, you can type your address onto a little website, Flood Factor, and it will immediately show a score pertaining to your flood risk potential on a score of 0 to 10, 10 being the worst. That exists in the United States, and there's absolutely no reason why that can't come to Canada, so we're doing that. And then we're deeply engaged, matter of fact, I spent much of the afternoon on this point, in working to retain and restore natural infrastructure in urban, suburban, and rural landscapes across the country, again, to mitigate flood risk, but also to support carbon capture and sequestration and biodiversity. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Blair. A little bit of a reality check. I'm wondering how many people put on their to-do list for tomorrow to go and check their downspouts and check out the sump pump. But we'll talk about that, I'm sure, during some of the questions later on. We're going to do questions for all the speakers afterwards, the two speakers, John and Blair. So we'll move on to John. Thanks so much, Blair. That was good practical information, and good to hear. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who many of you will know. He's local to us, and he's a big lead around resilience, sustainability, and climate action. Dr. John Anderson, who is a retired marine scientist who's been living in Owen Sound, I think, for about 9 years, when he's not somewhere on his off-grid property up the French River, which sounds absolutely fantastic. His research career was in Newfoundland. Generally, he worked for Department of Fisheries and Oceans as a research scientist, and also was teaching at Memorial University. He's been researching local climate change and also co-produced the climate change film released a couple of years ago, Resilience Transforming Our Community, that continues to inspire individual and collective action. So it's a wonderful piece to have come from our local area. John serves as a scientific advisor on climate change to many community groups and businesses, Big Edawatt Alliance, municipalities, and colleges and universities. And we've been lucky to have him at the table on a lot of our local climate action initiatives since he's been here in 2009. And John's going to bring us kind of close to home. I think he's been very interested in what's going on locally, and I understand we're going to hear about his research around the last 40 years and specifically around precipitation in the local area. So looking forward to hearing about that. Thanks, John. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jenny, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. I think this is a great participation and really good information from Blair. I just have a really short follow-up to Blair's presentation because I wanted to give a local perspective on increasing precipitation and extreme rainfall in our area. I found over the years giving talks in our area that when I bring the climate change home and I show people how things are happening here, it has had a much bigger impact. Well, I live here. I playfully say to people, I may live in Grey County, but it should actually be called Grayer County. And this is not because more and more retirees are moving to our area. No, it's because we're getting more and more rain as the decades march forward. And with more rain, we get ever grayer skies, hence Grayer County. Local precipitation data demonstrate we've been getting steadily wetter year over year for decades. For example, since 1970, when I was a young 20-year-old, we now average about 23% more precipitation every year. That's both rain and snow combined. But maybe you have not noticed because this change has occurred over decades, but I'll tell you, farmers have certainly noticed. Increasingly, they're having trouble getting crops planted in the spring and harvesting in the autumn. And as you just heard from Blair, the insurance industry has certainly noticed with ever increasing payouts due to flooding of our built infrastructure. Flooding is now the #1 insurance claim in Canada. But increasing annual precipitation is not the real story that concerns scientists and those people that insure you. It's the increasing variability in precipitation and the increase in extreme events. The increase in extreme precipitation has manifested itself in the flooding our streets, destroying farmers' crops, and in winter, some incredible community closing snowstorms. Last year, an important research paper was published by 2 young Canadian researchers. The title of their paper was quite illuminating. The title is, "Human Influence Has Intensified Extreme Precipitation in North America." The researchers, they divided North America into 9 regions and demonstrated our area, the Northeast, has had the greatest increase in extreme precipitation. And this starts happening in the late 20th century and is accelerating into the present time. Scientists have defined heavy rainfall events as one-day events and 5-day events. They say one-day events are important for flash flooding and infrastructure design, while 5-day events are more relevant to large-scale river flooding, when rivers overflow their banks and water sweeps across our landscape. So I looked at the extreme precipitation events here on the southern Bruce Peninsula for each day over the past 30 years. That's a total of 10,950 days worth of precipitation data. And these data demonstrated we were getting more and more 1-day and 5-day heavy rain events each decade. And the models show these trends will continue. The number of days when we received 10 or more millimeters of rain increased from an average of 29 during the 1990s, up to 32 in the 2000s, and then 36 days in the 2010s. And the 1-day maxima each of those decades were 60 millimeters, and then increasing to 67 millimeters, and then jumping up to 90 millimeters in the last decade. This decade, in the 1920s, we can expect this to increase to 39 1-day rain events of 10 or more millimeters. And in the 2030s, if these trends continue, we'll expect 42 days each year. When I looked at the 5-day extreme precipitation events, I found a more striking result. On those occasions when we received 50 or more millimeters of rain over a 5-day period, we've went from an average of 8 events in the 1990s, jumping to 10 in the 2000s, and then way up to 15 events in the 2010s. And that rate of increase is exponential, meaning that the rate of these heavy 5-day events is accelerating. A nonlinear model I fit to the data predicts we'll get an average of 25 events this decade, and then jumping to more than 38 events in the 2030s. So in summary, this analysis provides clear evidence that we are marching into a future of more extreme precipitation events, and that these will cause more flooding, more damage, and more financial loss. The 2 young scientists that published that landmark research paper last year told us that extreme precipitation events that used to happen every 100 years now happen every 20 years. And as the world continues to warm to 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial temperatures, they tell us we can expect these extreme events once every 5 years. Well, this is yet another example of our changing climate, and these are the futures we need to plan for and adapt for. So that's all I had to say tonight. Just a short comment on our increasing local precipitation. And so now back to the moderator, back to you, Jenny.
Yeah, I think we're going to go to Luke, and you're going to kind of coordinate the Q&A. There's lots of questions, and Anne and I can kind of just go through them one by one. They all look like they're about quite different subjects, don't they, Anne? So we can probably just start going through. Heather Sargent asked a question about how to get the information, and we already responded with, well, Blair responded, and then we responded with the actual link to the resources on the Intact Center site. So that's in the chat for folks. So, Anne, do you want to, it looks like Jennifer's is the first one.
So Jennifer Downham wanted to know, do municipalities hold any liability for flooding when a homeowner has identified a risk from a municipal source and asked for localized mitigation efforts, but they failed to do anything?
At the level of the individual homeowner with that degree of resolution, I think at the moment the answer would be no. However, there's currently a major class action lawsuit has been launched in Oakville, whereby a group of several thousand homeowners are suing the mayor of Oakville, the town of Oakville, Halton Conservation Authority, which is the local conservation body, and I think there's 1 or 2 more on that list, for allowing homes to be built on a floodplain. And then people, unbeknownst to them, they went ahead and bought these homes thinking that they were built under appropriate conditions that would not flood out. That's the fundamental tenet of the argument. And that case is now proceeding. And now, whether or not the defendants in this case are found liable or not, just the fact that this case is occurring is drawing a lot of attention with municipalities across the country. So I think increasingly so, it's probably fair to say that in Ontario, we have the conservation authorities, we have municipalities, and so forth. I think there's more and more attention is going to be placed on flood risk associated with where we build in or potential reinforcement of flood risk mitigation measures in existing communities. So it's an evolving area. Now, 5 years ago, that I wouldn't have, you know, and by the way, that's not the only case. There's other cases where insurers have sued municipalities for lack of diligence in putting measures in place to mitigate flood risk, that the insurance companies found themselves on the hook to pay out large sums of money for flood damage that, in their opinion, had the municipality been acting as it should, that damage wouldn't have occurred. And by the way, I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just stating that these events are occurring, all of which draws more attention to preparedness.
So we're going to see a bit of a changing environment around some of that liability, following through on some of those liability pieces. There's a question that sort of relates to that also from Luke, which is whether you can comment, Blair, on the floodplain maps, and are townships obliged to produce these and make them available?
Yeah, it was a question from Shauna, but I made it more public.
Yeah, well, right now, just for Canada as a whole, the floodplain maps, generally speaking, are about 20 to 25 years out of date. There's a lot of effort being put into bringing flood risk maps up to date, which will, by the way, combine both what's called pluvial and fluvial flooding. In other words, rivers overflowing their banks, or water coursing through sewer systems up into communities and flooding people out. So we're looking at updating the floodplain maps. In Ontario, where we have it's either 36 or 37 conservation authorities, it's sort of a mixed bag in terms of the availability of flood risk maps. With some conservation authorities, you can walk in, or maybe it's virtually walk in now, and get access to flood risk maps fairly readily. And in other ones, it's quite difficult. And I'm not saying that's deliberately limiting people in their access to flood maps. They may, in some localities or with some conservation authorities, just feel the maps are so out of date, they don't feel comfortable sharing them. So it's quite a mixed bag right now in terms of your ability to gain access to the flood risk maps. But one point to point out, by the way, is that and John alluded to this in his remarks as well, if you're in a recognized floodplain, even if it's an older floodplain map, should you pay attention to that? The answer is yes, for sure. That should give you a heightened sense of, gee whiz, I better put measures in place to protect myself to the degree that's within my power. But don't think that just because you're not in a flood zone, even if the map was totally up to date, that you cannot be flooded. For example, in my talk, I mentioned that there were 3,300 homes flooded in Burlington during a one-day event. About 85% of those homes that flooded would never show up on a flood risk map. As a general rule, because now what we're getting is these microburst storms that John referenced, more water coming down over shorter periods of time, that it's almost no matter where you are, perhaps with the exception of a mountaintop or something, but wherever your home is in a community, if you get 120 millimeters of rain over a 5-hour period, you want to have flood preparedness in place, independent of whether or not you're inside or outside relative to a flood risk map. I once gave a talk, it sounds like name dropping, but what the heck, with Calderon, the former president of Mexico, and he had a very good line. He said, if you own a home somewhere where it rains, you should prepare for flooding.
Yeah, sorry. So Blair, given what you just said, are the guidelines on limiting flood risk being sufficiently accessed and sought out by communities, municipalities, and homeowners?
In my opinion, as you might guess, not to the degree that should be happening, but they're increasingly so. There are drivers in place to push this stuff forward. For example, in communities and at the level of the individual house, if you put measures in place consistent with the direction that we've just described in the talk, you can realize, for example, a reduction of 5 to 15% in your insurance premium. Or it may be the difference between retaining insurance on your house versus not being able to get insurance for flood coverage. And I can tell you for sure, even at the larger level of the municipal insurers are looking at risk-adjusted insurance premiums for municipalities that put measures in place to mitigate flood risk at the level of the community itself. Going forward, I think what we're going to see, this is something I'm pursuing with a couple of the big banks right now, is that for homes and communities that have flood risk mitigation measures in place, for those homes, when you go to get a mortgage, can we get a few basis points shaved off the cost of a mortgage, because then the probability of flooding occurring is lower and the loan to value ratio relative to getting a mortgage is maintained. Home appraisers, we work a lot with the Appraisal Institute of Canada. I might have the title slightly, but in terms of home appraisals, increasingly so, you're going to see flood risk factored into home appraisals. And I also think it's not going to be that long, and by that long, I don't know the date, but let's say within 5 to 10 years, that when you look at real estate listings for homes, and you look at all the little boxes filled out about characteristics about a home you might purchase, you know, and we now have walking scores associated with communities. One way or another, I think we're going to see a flood risk score on these listings in the not too distant future. And I believe that'll be another catalyst, that when you're going to buy a home, which for most people is your biggest investment in life, and it's probably your retirement fund, you will pay attention to, by the way, this house just ranked poorly relative to flood risk, or maybe being positive, it ranked very, very well. So from a multitude of perspectives, awareness on this issue will be forthcoming. And by the way, when we talk about Public Safety Canada, just before the talk started, we were talking a little bit about disaster flood assistance relief, DFAA, disaster financial assistance arrangements, which is for, in the colloquial, it refers to bailout money that can come to communities that experience excessive extreme events, in this case flooding, beyond a certain level. They're eligible for DFAA payouts, which is money, bailout money that comes from Public Safety Canada. But a little while ago, meaning a year and a half ago, our group, we did a ranking of the flood preparedness of the largest 16 cities in Canada. I gave them a score from an A- to a B+ to a C, whatever it might be, relative to a bunch of measures. One of the things that people responded to, these are flood risk experts in communities, they said, one of the reasons they don't bring the flood risk maps up to date is because if they do bring them up to date and then have a major flood and a bunch of damage occurs and they hadn't put the measures in place to mitigate the flood risk, they weren't eligible for DFAA assistance. But if they didn't bring the flood risk up to date, they could claim that they simply didn't know, and therefore they were now eligible for the bailout money. So the mechanism is basically, the incentive is backwards. It should be that to be eligible, you should have to have the update of flood risk maps and then hopefully demonstrate that you made some effort to mitigate the flood risk.
Yep, thanks.
By the way, you can't blame me, I didn't know. I don't think that's very fair.
It seems backwards. Following on the same vein with the flood protection measures, why aren't these flood protection measures incorporated into building codes, or are they in some cases? With new development, it sounds like they may be.
Yeah, they're coming along now. So the building codes, we have the national building codes. We have a national building code, and then it's up to the provinces to embrace the building code, which most of the time they will. So we've only done the research in the last few years to really identify the mechanisms to put in place to mitigate the risk. So it's basically working its way through the system. Is it working fast enough? I think the answer is no, but at least it is being worked into the system. And also, though, I do find that, you know, with builders, developers, increasingly so, they are asking questions about how do I build a community or, you know, assemblage of homes in a manner that the probability of flooding being problematic is lower. So it is coming along. And by the way, depending on the province you're in Ontario, the conservation authorities have a lot of authority over where you can build and not build relative to flood risk. But that only exists in Ontario. Once you're outside, all the other provinces in Canada, they defer to the discretion of the municipalities as to where they're going to let people build or not. So if a municipality recognizes that somewhere over here, to your right is a floodplain. The province defers the authority as to build on that floodplain or not to the municipality. And by the way, there are still a lot of people in this country who are not convinced climate change is real, never mind human induced. And they will say, you know what, I've lived here for 30 years. I've never seen water in that area. Your modelers are telling me that that's a floodplain. They don't realize that the weather of the past is not a good predictor of the weather of the future, and they might allow for building to occur there. And by the way, they're not completely irrational. I understand their argument in the sense that they'll say, and we want the property tax revenue base that comes from that development that allows us to build a new arena or whatever it might be. And that, there's merit to that. But I understand that for many, many people, they lived in an area for 30 or 40 years, never seen flooding in a particular region. And then these people come along, these modelers, and say, oh, by the way, that now is subject to flooding going forward. They'll look at it and go, well, they think they have 5 heads. And so it is hard for a lot of people to think that the dynamic of the weather has actually changed. But you have to remember, we have changed the chemistry of the atmosphere. When you change the chemistry of the atmosphere, the weather is going to change.
Right.
And John did a very nice job, by the way, illustrating that locally, documenting that locally.
Right, this one actually, Blair, is coming from me. You talked a lot about protecting natural infrastructure. And when you talk about it, you talk mostly about wetlands. And I wondered whether you are also including woodlands and meadows in that.
Yeah, so if I just said wetlands, it means I misspoke. We're really talking forests, fields, and wetlands. We're talking ecosystems, retaining ecosystems in place, all of which are, sponges, if you will, to retain water on the landscape and allow it to discharge slowly into the groundwater system or subsequently downstream. So it's the collective of the ecosystem and the watershed that we should be preserving. And sometimes I slip and say wetlands.
Thank you.
This is a fairly long question from Mike Myatt, who's one of our local vice deputy mayors, and it relates to the rising Georgian Bay Lake Huron lake levels and some of the up and down that we've seen, and particularly in 2019 when there was disastrous high lake levels. So the question relates to the credibility of what is published by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that Mike follows quite closely, it sounds like. And it's really around what are the U.S. Army Corps is talking about data which says that the lake levels are going to continue to go up and up and up. So you can see it there. It's quite a long question, but there is a workshop that was attended by Mike which spoke about the prediction of continuation of rising lake levels year over year for the next 5 to 10 years. So do you have comments about the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers data and any thoughts about the Lake Huron lake levels? And John Anderson may want to weigh in on this. Wade in, he says, which is quite an appropriate use of the word wade. So maybe Blair first, and then John might want to add something.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't question the credibility of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I would lay substantial credit to their credibility, if you will. And I also think, going forward, yes, we are going to see, and I say all the models, not just U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, talks about higher lake levels going forward. This is why, and I've already talked to the Standards Council of Canada on this. This is, I can tell you for sure, we're going to create a standard for the Great Lakes relative to shoreline resiliency standard. Like that is going to happen. I can tell you for sure because we're going to do it. And and I mean, the dynamic of water control in the Great Lakes is pretty problematic. For example, just a little bit more downstream, if you talk about Lake Ontario, people say sometimes, well, the lake level's too high in Lake Ontario, let some more water out through the Saunders Dam downstream. When you do that, you've got to remember that, I don't know the exact time frame, but if you release 1 inch of water out of the Great Lakes through the Saunders Dam at the east end of Lake Ontario over a short period of time, that results in about 8 to 9 inches of elevation down in the Montreal area. So, you might solve the problem for Lake Ontario, but you create a heck of a problem for Montreal. So, so I'll leave it there and let John comment.
Well, yeah, I've just follow up on Blair. The Army Corps of data are good. We all use it. The governments use it, and it's quite reliable. As far as the most recent predictions, I was just reading that today. A friend of mine works for Sutherland Construction. They now have one crew full time on lakeshore maintenance, lakeshore infrastructure, rebuilding, and then prevention as they go forward. And so he's quite interested in the Great Lakes. We're down a little bit in Michigan here in this year, and so the trend is down. And the current modeling data is saying that the lake level will continue to decline until 2030, and then we're going to hit a new minima. And the prediction is it's going to be 40 centimeters lower than the previous low that we've ever observed, and that was back in 1964. And so that just underscores the previous model predictions that these changes are going to occur much more quickly than in the past, and we're going to get higher highs and lower lows.
So what you're saying is the 64 prediction and modeling has now been shifted, and now we're looking at significant increases year over year, as the engineers have said.
Well, what I'm saying, Jenny, is the U.S. Army Corps of Data. I was just looking at this today, so the numbers are fresh. We've had three minimum periods in the past. One was 1929, one was 1964, and the most recent was 2013. And of those three minima, the lowest was 1964. And so reference to that, the next one's going to be 40 centimeters lower. So we're going to set a new record in 2030 based on the modeling. And I could follow up just briefly on Blair. Blair would know much more than this than I do, but these ideas that you can control the lake levels, like you can make the low levels higher and the high levels lower, is extremely limited. The data clearly show that high and low lake levels occur primarily because of the precipitation and runoff within the watershed itself. And so unless you're controlling all those rivers and all those creeks and all those aspects of water coming into your the Great Lakes from the watershed, you have very little control over these highs and these lows. But people will get upset because they've built near the shore. One of the prime recommendations I've read for going forward in terms of adaptation is giving up these areas that are at high prone risk and just giving them back to the wetlands and the natural infrastructure that Blair talks about. And that will really minimize our insurance costs and damage in the future.
Yeah, in one of the statements I put in my, there's a session I attended 18 months ago was, lake levels were going to climb pretty rapidly over the next, 5+ years. And October data, with Army Corps of Engineers, it's down 13 inches between, the same month, October 2020 to October 2021. The Lake Huron is down 13 inches. And I guess my question, Blair and John, you get to these workshops and you look at the modeling and the data, and I believe in science and I believe in scientists. And I just sometimes you hear, I just heard a 40 centimeter drop by 2030, John, and that's new information for me. So I guess my comment is that you tend to hear different sets of data from workshop to workshop, it almost seems. So that's just a comment, really. Whether there's any right or wrong here, it just the information varies, I find. So just a comment.
Well, just to go back to you, Mike, model projections will be general guesses at the future, and so you can undershoot or overshoot those as we go forward. To be predicting 9 years out is, that's just a prediction for planning purposes. We may not set a new record low, we may indeed set a new record low. So there's always going to be variability, and we tend to talk about the trends and the middle value, or the mean or the median, but there's variability around that.
And does the modeling include the impacts of climate change?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So the two big drivers from climate change is that, as I've said, we're getting more and more rain, and that's true throughout the Lake Superior down through Lake Ontario watersheds. And that precipitation goes directly in, and then it comes as runoff. The snow, we've had some pretty good snow years recently, that spring runoff. The second driver, which counteracts that, is evaporation. And if you're looking at the ice on the Great Lakes, you're seeing we are getting less and less and less ice over the decades. And so that means there's more open water that's enhancing the precipitation. And when you look at the annual cycle of winds, we get our highest winds when there's supposed to be ice there, or where there historically was ice there. So these two drivers are climate change, and they're pumping more and more energy into the system, which is driving these extremes more rapidly. So that's just observation. Those aren't models.
Thank you for allowing me to chime in there, Luke. I just want to say thank you to Blair and John and the whole committee for doing this. This has been, very enlightening. So thank you.
And by the way, if it's useful to you, I'll make a point of, we have our coastline, and I'm not the expert. We have a person on our team who's leading it. There's about 80 people involved who developed the coastline resiliency standard that'll come out in, I think, about a month or something for the Atlantic and the Pacific coast. But there's a large sections in that on how we can utilize natural infrastructure along shorelines to mitigate flood risk and shoreline damage and erosion. Let me make a note of sharing that document with you when we have it, because there may be some transferability of ideas in that to the shoreline of the Great Lakes. But I certainly, and I defer to John as the expert here, but I think John hit the nail on the head as well when he talked about there's going to be more high highs and low lows, which make management very, very difficult, because you've got to plan on the worst in both situations. But for sure, I'll make sure I share that document with you when it comes out.
And many of us will look forward to seeing the shoreline resiliency standard that's underway, which will be relevant to the Great Lakes, right?
Well, this one is for the coast, but then we'll do the one for the Great Lakes, and that's not going to take too long. I know the president of the Standards Council of Canada pretty well, and we've already got the thumbs up from her that this is needed for. And the reason it's needed, it's just as the mayor is suggesting. There's a lot of towns and communities on the Great Lakes that need this guidance, and it's a different kettle of fish, that I can say for sure, as what we're realizing on the Atlantic and the Pacific coast.
Right.
Good.
Thanks. And can you bring in Joachim's question maybe?
Yeah, so actually, I just want to comment that the folks in Georgian Bluffs watch the water and the water levels really, really closely. So this is a really relevant discussion for us. So Joachim has a question that some municipalities, including Owen Sound, have developed corporate climate adaptation plans, which only include corporate infrastructure. Should we not develop a municipal adaptation plan, which includes corporate as well as citizen infrastructure, as they both intersect in flood prevention and mitigation?
Well, my answer to that question is yes, for sure. I think it's both working in combination. I think it's an astute question that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, that's why we work so much with the insurance brokers, real estate agents, home appraisers, mortgage providers, and so forth. I think sometimes too often on the climate file, you read the newspapers and so it's like the onus is always on government to solve the problem. And I think, it's perfectly fine. Government has a major role to play federally, provincially, municipally. But also that doesn't negate that individuals have a responsibility to move the file forward. Corporations have a responsibility. I spend a huge amount of my time now also with institutional investors, the major pension plans that invest money in infrastructure and builds, and the need for them and the means for them to incorporate physical climate risk into investment decision-making when you're building roads, when you're building bridges, when you're building communities. The institutional investors have huge influence. So I think sometimes there's too much turning to government to solve the problems and not enough to consider other sources that should also be part of the solution.
And this question from Heather is related exactly to that. A lot of responsibility seems to be dumped on municipalities. Should the liability be with municipalities or with companies that extract and sell products that increase or have contributed to greenhouse gas emissions? The question is, where do we direct our concern and blame? Are there federal or provincial policies that we should be supporting to cover coming costs?
Well, I mean, right now there is a monumental movement. You almost can't pick up the Globe and Mail on a daily basis without finding something about, you know, the investment industry moving through transition risk and jettisoning companies in portfolios that are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. The major pension fund case, for example, in Quebec, just the other day divested all investments in Suncor, for example. And that's one strategy to drive the behavior to mitigate carbon footprint. But then there's an equally valid argument the other way. I work with other pension funds who say, no, we want to maintain our investment position with some of these extractive, for example, companies in the oil, gas, petroleum sector, because we can have an influence on them mitigating their footprint to a greater degree if we're invested in them versus if we're not, through shareholder resolutions. And their argument is, you know, if we sell that stock, somebody else is going to buy it, and maybe someone else is going to buy it and is going to have a less positive influence. And by the way, I'm not saying, my personal view is both strategies have merit, you know, but every major pension fund, I think there's like 19,000 pension plans in Canada or something, whatever the number was, I heard the other day. And but when you go to OMERS, Teachers, CASE, HOOP, Canada Pension Plan, right down the line, boy, oh boy, it's ESG is the term that's become very popular lately, environmental social governance. And 30 years ago, it was called sustainable development. Now it's called ESG. But it's really taken off ESG in terms of incorporation into investment decision-making. And right now on the climate file, I can tell you for sure, like guaranteed, because I'm rather deeply involved in it, the focus is on transition risk, i.e. Mitigating carbon footprint, or the influence of corporate activities on carbon footprint, not very much on the incorporation of physical climate risk into investment decision-making. And that's the part of this equation that we're addressing, is the incorporation of physical climate risk. And if I'm not speaking too much, maybe I could just end with, or add one more point here. My personal view is that when we think about climate change, we should think about climate change as sitting on the platform of a three-legged stool. There are three ways to address climate change. One is through mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, which is where the bulk of the effort has been to date. Number two is adapting to extreme weather risks, the floods, fires, drought, hail, winds, snowstorm, sea level rise, permafrost loss, etc. The second stool is adaptation. The third stool that we don't hear nearly enough about, but we really have to double down on, is carbon capture and sequestration, is actually getting carbon out of the atmosphere. And right now we have about, I didn't see the exact number lately, but it's about 412 or 414 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Historically, over the last 1.5 years, that's been about 285 parts per million. It's going up 2 parts per million every single year. We have to focus on carbon capture and sequestration with the enthusiasm, and this is what I think should come through the COP meetings in a couple of weeks, with the enthusiasm with which we dedicate it to something like the Manhattan Project. We have to address mitigation, adaptation, carbon capture and sequestration. We have to do all three simultaneously, and if we don't do it well, that stool will collapse, period.
I really like your three-legged stool analogy, Blair. I just made a note and drew a picture. I think it's a terrific one. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So question from Barry and Deb Randall. How much can greening our urban environments reduce the flood risk? Green roofs, rain gardens, natural swales, etc.
Well, you know, it's a perfectly legitimate, good question. I can tell you through the operationalization of those types of measures within urban or suburban environments, if I had to guess, and there's variance attached to this, but I think we'd be in the zone of about 20 to 40% reduction in costs associated with flooding, somewhere in that zone. And that's based on various aspects of research that have engaged in this question. But as to an exact number, I can't say, and it probably is idiosyncratic also relative to locality. And by the way, natural infrastructure within urban or suburban environments, it's not just the flood risk. We also have a report coming out in, I hesitate to say we keep having these reports coming out, but right now we've got 4 lined up, and we're looking at the timing of them all. But we're releasing another report on extreme heat and how to adapt to extreme heat, because it is going to get a lot hotter in certainly Southern Ontario going forward, for sure. You know, I could give you all the numbers, but the bottom line is it's going to be a lot hotter and lethally so. And one means or mechanism to mitigate the urban heat island effect is through an elevated tree canopy in urban and suburban areas to produce more shade. So we should be thinking about the benefits associated with flood risk mitigation, but also what we can do to limit the problems associated with extreme heat. And by the way, parenthetically, extreme heat is a problem in the sense that when we talk about floods and fires in the country, and I don't want to be indelicate here, but generally speaking, the costs associated with flooding and fires, they're financial in nature. It's not very often someone dies in a flood or a fire. You still get a few deaths, but not that many. And more than one is bad. But extreme heat is a whole new ballgame. We had approximately 500 people die in British Columbia this past summer with premature deaths directly attributable to extreme heat. About 3 years ago in Quebec, we had 90 people die due to extreme heat. And if we get extreme heat combined with an electricity outage, in those 2 incidences I just mentioned, the electricity was running. But if you get an extreme heat event combined with an electricity outage, the deaths won't be in the hundreds, they'll be in the thousands. Extreme heat kills. And so, you know, we're working, so our report on extreme heat, if you watch our website, that'll be out in about a month as well. And we can address extreme heat, by the way, through behavioral modification, through time of work of day, and through programs set up to check on vulnerable people in the population that live alone and perhaps elderly in the back of a rooming house, or who's watching them during an extreme heat event to make sure they're okay. We have directives pertaining to infrastructure for high-rise towers to make sure that in apartment buildings, we have backup generation to run elevators and keep minimal service going during a heat event. And then we have urban infrastructure modifications towards white roofs and more tree canopy and so forth. And all of this is in this extreme heat report that about, I think it was over 80 people contributed to this, subject matter experts in all different areas. Sorry to wander off onto extreme heat there, but I just thought I'd mention it.
So this is a comment or question and comment from Stuart James Burgess, and it has to do with the rerouting of water and converting what was a lot of wet swamplands on the peninsula into first grazing land and now croplands. And so his comments are that it's been changed over the last 100 years, and now the main highway goes through the center, and it's moved now from cattle. And now there were drainage systems for cash crops. And there's a question around, this ends up in the bay eventually. Is this a bad development, this rerouting of water and converting a swamp into cropland?
I'll defer to John. He knows the local geography better than I do.
Yeah, I think it does. And just like an anecdotal story, where we used to live up to 2 years ago, there was a large field that it lying dormant for a number of years, and then they came in and they cleared out all the hedgerows, and they made a massive agro-industrial farming area, and they tiled the whole field. And a friend of mine out there, he was maintaining the houses so this is up on the cliff down near the lakeshore, and it just, the next year it led to a large amount of flooding in that area and a lot of silt from all the soil coming out, and that was directly a result of tiling the field. And a lot of farmers are tiling because of the very fact that we're getting more rain. And a really simple measure of this is the Gray Saba Conservation Authority. They produce a map, and they've broken it down by all the individual watersheds within the GSCA area. And you can go and see the impacts on water quality as a really good measure. So just go to the GCA website and go and look at their water quality maps, and you'll see the impacts.
And what about Scott?
Just kind of reviewing Scott. So this is from Scott, who is also in municipal governance. Often we compare relative population to the US, for example, 10%, recognizing the staggering cost borne in the US to natural disasters. Can you comment on the dollar relationship of losses to what we're experiencing in Canada?
We're probably not in quite as bad shape in Canada due to extreme weather in terms of losses that have been realized in the United States relative to hurricane, starting probably most notably with Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, the cold snap in Texas last winter. But the extreme events are certainly hitting Canada. The two most costly events in Canada to date were it was the 2013 flooding in Calgary, the 2016 fire in Fort McMurray. We had events before those. We had the Slave Lake fire in 2011. 2013, when it was flooding in Calgary, we also had a major $1 billion flood in Toronto. But what I worry about is just a month ago or something like that, you would have seen on the news a massive flooding in Germany and France and Belgium, where they had, because they're with inches, they had 10 or 11 inches of rain come down over 24 to 48 hour periods. The most we've tended to have in Canada so far is about maybe 150 to 200 millimeters of rain, resulting in the flooding. And well, there are other factors involved as well, but the Calgary floods, the Toronto floods. But there's absolutely no reason to think that the events that happened in Europe, that the floods of those magnitudes can't happen here. And we need to prepare. We need to prepare rapidly. And one of the fundamental problems is we're still very often chasing climate change. We're managing disasters. We're not managing risks, and we've got to get ahead of the curve. And so we have the tools to do it now. And now it's a matter of inclination. And by the way that we're operationalizing adaptation in Canada, it's very much a mixed bag. Some cities are very much on board and pursuing the adaptation aggressively, and others not with the same enthusiasm. But increasingly so, we need to also get, I think, and I certainly include myself in this, that I could do a better job on messaging, that when we look at adaptation, it differs from investments in adaptation, and I think this is realized a fair bit in the US, perhaps more so than in Canada. When we invest $1 in adaptation, when you invest in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, the benefits accrue to the global commons. And you kind of hope that China and India and Russia and so forth are also doing the same thing. And sometimes people will say, well, if they're not doing it, why would we do it? But on adaptation, the story's different, because if you spend $1 on adaptation in Owen Sound, you get the benefits of that expenditure in that community directly. If you put a larger diameter sewer drainage pipe in a community built to accommodate greater flood risk, you get the benefit of that dollar investment locally. Also, when you invest in adaptation, it's effectively the gift that keeps on giving. In other words, once you've put the measures in place to mitigate the damage associated with flooding or fire or whatever it might be, not only do you save the next time the major event occurs, you save the time after that, the time after that, the time after that. So when people say to me, what's the return on investment for adaptation? My answer is, will you give me the time frame and I'll give you the return. As a general rule of thumb, for every dollar invested, and this is in multiple studies around the world, come up with these same ratios. And why it works out to this, I don't know, but it does. For every dollar invested in adaptation, on average, we realize $3 to $8 in savings per 10-year period for damage that now does not occur. And the Global Commission on Adaptation in the Netherlands was the last I saw to come out with these numbers. And these are very close to what we calculated and other organizations. So I think what we need to do is to bring constituents on board, for example, and you say to people, by the way, the investment we're making in adaptation here, you get 100% of the benefit locally. For every dollar invested, you get a $3 to $8 return. And by the way, it's per 10-year period. And there are some compelling reasons to bring adaptation on board.
Is the Global Commission on Adaptation Netherlands study that you quote, is that part of the report resource page on the Impact Center? That's a very powerful set of numbers, the 1 to 3 to 8. It's very powerful.
Yeah, it's in various of our reports.
Okay.
Because usually in the introduction of the reports, you have to build the argument for why you want to do this stuff. And we know those guys very, very well. And by the way, they were quite impressed in Canada at the Global Commission, which was chaired by Prime Minister Trudeau and Mark Rutte, who's the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who enormously nice guy who gets this stuff very well. They were very impressed on the degree to which in Canada we've developed these standards and guidelines just to give us the guidance on how to solve the problem. They weren't even that far yet in many countries in Europe.
Okay. Very interesting. The question from Anne, again, back to the shoreline conversation. Can maintaining natural infrastructure on shorelines help to deal with rising and lowering of water levels?
I certainly will draw on John, but my short answer here is yes. And we need to be looking at the natural succession of nature as it from the shoreline on upwards, which is generally grasses, shrubs, followed by grasses, transitioning to shrubs, transitioning to trees. We want to do a better job at maintaining natural infrastructure along shorelines to mitigate risk, as opposed to cutting this stuff all down. We want to retain riparian buffer zones along flowing water systems, and it would seem to me, and I know the experts I talk to on this topic anyhow, they very much look at natural infrastructure working with built infrastructure hand in glove to mitigate, in this case, shoreline impacts. And we're also working to try to bring other major influencers on board in this regard onto being more accepting of natural infrastructure is good stuff to have to mitigate risk. One of the organizations being the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, that all solutions don't have to be realized in concrete. And that's not anti-concrete, by the way, but it's built infrastructure, natural infrastructure working hand in glove. And by the way, I think John could probably give a much better answer to this than I can. But
John, do you want to add to that?
All right, I think Blair and I are reading the same thing, so I very much agree with that. There are clearly places where we have to build infrastructure. I was talking with Dennis Kefalis 2 or 3 weeks ago. He's the charge of works here in the city of Owen Sound, and he's very proud that they've rebuilt the shoreline out at Kelso Beach Park. And that's an important area for the city of Owen Sound, and we were losing it, and it's been reclaimed, and he's raised the stage so summer folk can proceed again when we have high water. So just agreeing with Blair.
I guess that connection with this question as well from Odette: should shoreline communities allow built development along waterfront?
Well, again, you're going to have yes and no answers to that, and it's going to be a sensible approach to building infrastructure that's not going to be at high risk. And I think this is one of Blair's messages tonight, that our planning processes has to really recognize the risk, and not the risk of the past, but the risk of the future that's coming. And we've got enough data now over decades to tell us this is where we're going. So it's sensible, sustainable development that identifies risk.
And one of the points I would also perhaps add is you cannot cheat this system, period. If you pretend that this phenomena does not exist, we will lose. We are losing, and we've got to catch up. And you might get away with ignoring the risk for a little bit of time, but it will catch up. And by the way, that catastrophic loss claims data I showed you in the opening slides, remember that curve is bending upwards. So there is no way to ignore this stuff. And I think just wait. When we had the Calgary floods, the combined insurable, non-insurable losses, there were somewhere around $9 billion. The Fort McMurray fire was somewhere around insurable, non-insurable losses, somewhere around $10 billion. Wait till we have the 25 or $35 billion flood that shuts down the Port of Vancouver or the city of Montreal and so forth. We really do have to prepare for this stuff with a sense of urgency. And boy, oh boy, we're seeing these events now all over the world. And And the big dangerous one though that's lurking that I think we're totally unprepared for is extreme heat. I'm not trying to depress everybody, by the way.
No, it's very nice. Maybe maybe we do on that note, Blair. I mean, there was a nice, not a depression, but there was also a nice question from Joachim about how do you feed how do you personally keep it going, and how do you feed your hope and your enthusiasm when you deal with this kind of slightly depressing data. And that's maybe a nice question to end with before we move. Maybe both to Blair and to you, John.
Well, for me, anyhow, personally, I don't spend 30 seconds on defeatism. The cards that are on cards that you're dealt are the cards you're dealt. Period. So the question is, what do we do? With the risk that's on the ground right now, and not trying is not an option. I don't spend 10 seconds on that. And sometimes, matter of fact, next week I have to do something with CPAC and the journalists in the country, and how they present messaging on climate change and so forth. And might that turn people off if you're too blatant in how you present things, or if you sugarcoat it too much, maybe that doesn't motivate people enough. My personal view is I don't over or understate the argument. I simply tell it as best I understand it, and without making it worse or better than the reality of the situation as I understand it. For me personally, the formidability of the challenge, I think of it as in a way, perversely perhaps, as a motivator. It's a call to arms. It's a little bit like you're Winston Churchill sitting in England in 1938, and you look not too far away and you see a country arming itself to the hilt, and they're not doing that for amusement. The question is, well, what do you do? Lay down and die, or do you fight? And in my opinion, there's no option here. There's only one way to go, and that is you fight, and you fight harder, period.
Yeah, you can't talk about this stuff for years, over a decade now. I've been talking about this stuff without having hope and maintaining a sense of balance. I use a couple of analogies. If you're diagnosed with a chronic disease, I want to be the person that mitigates and adapts to that disease. I don't want to just give up on it. And another analogy I've used, having gone to sea for 30 years of my life, I spent a lot of time in the North Atlantic Ocean. And if your ship is in trouble and you're down to one engine and you're taking on water, I don't go down to the bar for another drink. I head for the lifeboats. So it's that kind of adaptation. But beyond that, it's working with people like this group here tonight. And it's also my grandkids, I'm thinking of those, and I want my grandkids to know I was trying to do something, and I was trying to help.
Yeah, fantastic. So as you've noted, there has been a lot of questions, and I think we've been fielding questions and answers, and thanks to everybody who came up with the question, made for a very rich discussion, and these additional pieces of information that didn't come through in the presentation, and it's so valuable to hear these little anecdotes and little sidebars, and that really kind of enriched the discussion. So thanks to everyone, and thanks to Blair and John. Jenny, do you want to give a bit of background on what we had in mind?
Yeah, I'll just make it fairly quick. A couple of points. I'm sure people have been hearing about the just transition and the push for the federal government to prioritize in their first 100 days of being in office. Just transition, which includes not only legislation to build a low carbon economy, but it also includes sort of the social, economic, environmental policies that need to go along with that. So there's a lot of action going on with that right now, and I would really ask people to look at some of the material that is available under Just Transition. I can share the links, and also consider sending a letter to Justin, to our Prime Minister, which identifies that they need to be thinking of legislation, just transition legislation, which would include specifically moving to low carbon economy and all the elements that relate to that. So I will put the some of the information about that in a link about how you can take that action to write a letter or ask for this to take top priority. And the second piece, which I'll also put links in, is that tomorrow night, the Climate Forum is hosting, the local Climate Forum is hosting a session on just transition at 7 p.m. That's October 21st tomorrow. So I will put the Facebook registration links also in the chat, and I would really encourage people to take part in that, because this is really how we can have some impact at a federal level, and also think about what in our community, what do we need to have happening with regard to, jobs and employment and a green economy and all those pieces. So it's an opportunity and a time for us to take some individual action around this that can have a higher level impact. So just to bring that forward, and I'll put some links in the chat.
Okay, final piece then. Again, thanks for that, Jenny. Danuta, can I hand it over to you for some of the closing remarks?
Yes, you can. And I'd like to ask everyone who's still with us to remain with us, because I have a couple of other announcements to make and some important thank yous. Thank you very much, Dr. Blair Feltmate, for what I've very engaging and convincing presentation and participating in this wonderful discussion that we've just had. So I think I really am happy that I've been able to bring you in as a speaker. And again, thank you so much for that. And thank you to Dr. John Anderson for providing additional perspective and contributing to the conversation as well. And I want to thank everyone who's here, who joined us tonight, and for making this happen, for helping us bring these conversations forward. I'd like to make a special thank you towards those who chose to pay for their tickets, because that was an option which will enable us to bring further events forward, because we are needing to generate funds in order to do that. Georgian Bluffs Climate Action Team is not funded, and so our volunteer members have been working hard to bring relevant events out for the community. That is what we want to do. So on behalf of Georgian Bluffs Climate Action Team and everyone who's listening, thank you to our speakers, Dr. Feltmate and Dr. Anderson. Two announcements I have to make. Jenny already made the third for me, so about the Just Transition forum tomorrow night. These links are all going to be in the chat. Our Grey Bruce Climate Action Team normally meets monthly, unless we're doing an event like tonight, on the third Mondays of the month. So our next meeting is on November 15th at 7 p.m. If anyone listening is interested in joining us, just email the email, which will be in the chat, a2gbcat@bmts.com. And it was in your invitation as well, to receive the Zoom link to join us, to find out more about what we're doing as a local group. And we are launching, one of the things we are planning to do, this is my final announcement, is to launch a virtual book club, and is going to be coming very soon. And it's another idea to reach people that would be interested in participating in a group that can read a series of, we're calling it 4 Books to Heal the World. And so there's been four pivotal books have been chosen by a group of us, and we are planning to run a Zoom group that will, we will be able to use breakout rooms so that smaller groups of people can discuss the reading that they've been doing. So it's going to have a start date and an end date, a 4-month period to read the 4 books, as most book clubs operate. So watch our email, or email us for information about that. We will also be emailing out the information about that when we're ready to launch, and it'll be within the next week. So that's all I have to say, and thank you again, everybody.
Thanks, Danuta. And again, thanks everybody for joining, and particular thanks to our presenters. And we hope to see you soon on a next event. So until then.